And I come to the conclusion that at some times we just don't know what the answer is. I don't pretend to know what the good is that can come out of all of the things that I've encountered in my life. But I know the good that I have encountered came directly from the hand of the Lord, and there's really no second best option that I can find.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and today I'm joined by Darrell Wilson, whose marriage and family was salvaged by finding hope in sobriety in his higher power while he was in his early 20s, only to later endure his wife leaving him after 32 years and his son passing away from his own struggles with addiction. Join us as Darrell describes how he found hope in his higher power to express purpose out of so much pain. This is a deep, tough discussion, and I hope you stick this one out to the end. Hi, and thank you for checking out another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and just like always, we're going to start out with a little bit of housekeeping, and just want to remind everybody that while we do encourage everybody who comes on the podcast to share from their experiences in their recovery program, nobody who is on this podcast, myself included, is a representative or spokesperson of the recovery programs that they're speaking about. So, take encouragement. Definitely, draw from the hope that we've all come to share about the recovery programs we're a part of. But the reality is that we're all sinners and we're all broken still, and we could go back out. That does not mean that the programs don't work. It means that we're human. So, with that said, and that out of the way, I am very excited. I've been excited all day for this this interview with Mr. Darrell, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I imagine there's probably more fun things to do with you Thursday night, but I'm glad you're here with me. So
I'm honored to be here.
Yeah,
I've been looking forward to this too.
So, real quick, just give us introduce yourself a little bit, maybe briefly touch on the things you struggle with, and maybe kind of brush over any experiences with recovery programs that you're a part of, or the things that you're doing, and then we'll kind of take it back and start from the beginning, or as far back as you want to go.
Okay.
How does that sound?
Sounds great.
All right, let's do it.
Well, yeah, so my name is Darrell, and today I'm more involved with Celebrate Recovery. So, I typically introduce myself as a follower of Christ who has struggled in the past with addiction, codependency, and grief. My recovery journey started with Narcotics Anonymous, and then after about 9 months, I wound up relapsing, was out for about 5 months, and then I came back, and after I came back, I was pretty much exclusively AA. Mm-hmm. And then probably for the first 2 years, I kind of had an encounter with Christ actually before that relapse. And once I came back from that relapse, I was pretty much exclusively AA. And then some years into my recovery, I really started to get involved with church and things like that. So even though I had an early experience with Jesus Christ, I was really most of my spiritual development happened in AA. And I credit AA for my relationship with Jesus Christ, because AA was the one that made that possible, kind of broke down some of those barriers that I had from church hurt, in the past.
Yeah, that seems to be church hurt, and kind of that there seems to be a theme that I've noticed in the interviews that I've done so far, where a lot of us come in with some church hurt, with some misconceptions about God, misconceptions about what the church is meant to be, and how we fit in it, and most of us feel like we just don't. And I definitely want to touch on that, but if you want, let's start back as early as you want. So we typically, share a little bit about your childhood, if there was anything important that came up, or go back as far as you'd like to go into that, and we'll start kind of use that as a launching point.
Okay. Well, I actually had a pretty good upbringing. I was, raised by fairly normal parents. I mean, my parents were really good parents. I was raised in church, and as far back as I can remember, church was a part of my life. I can remember being in the nursery and in the little kids area, and playing with toys and stuff like that. My parents, they divorced when I was about 13, and that was kind of a change in trajectory within our family. The whole family had been involved in church, and when my mom and dad decided to split up, my mom was, as the initiator of the divorce, was invited not to come back to church anymore. And so that was a big offense for me.
Sure.
Anytime that anything happens to one of your parents that hurts them, you tend to take that personally, particularly as a 13-year-old kid.
Right. Especially with your mom.
Right.
So you mentioned that it changed the trajectory. Did it affect you? I mean, that's a dumb question. Obviously it affect you, but in what ways did you, I mean, obviously emotionally, did it affect your faith? Obviously, is that kind of where the church hurt began? And was that something that continued to grow, or did that kind of slowly, kind of phase you out of church, or how did that affect you in your teenage years and moving forward?
Well, so when I was in elementary school, number one, I was a terrible student. My entire
Me too.
life in school, I was a terrible student, which is ironic because I call myself a compulsive learner. I just love to learn and I love to study, but I was terrible in school, and so we were forced to go to a Christian school from grade 2 on, from second grade on. And I had actually failed the second grade because, again, as long as I can remember, I was a terrible student. Mm-hmm. And I hated that school. I loved Sunday school. The idea of going to a Christian school sounded good until the first day. And then the first day, I remember coming home and saying, I don't want to go back to regular school.
What was it? What was it that kind of just...
They were just strict. There was a lot of rules. You couldn't have your hair, couldn't touch your ears. It couldn't come down below your eyebrows. It couldn't touch your color. The girls had to have dresses that were like 2 or 3 inches below their knees. And just some really... There was... and then... really a lot of discipline with, how, if you were talking in class and stuff like that, there was some fairly, severe consequences to doing things that we used to get away with in the public school. They just had a much higher standard, and I didn't like being held to a higher standard,
Right. So did you all the way through your, I guess, what do you call that? Your primary education, through your high school years, was that all in a Christian school? No,
it was up to, I think it was 6th grade.
Okay.
And
so then they threw you back in the real world, I should say.
Right. Yeah. So that was about the time that my parents were splitting up. And so Christian schools are expensive, and they couldn't afford to do that. And so we were going to go back to the public school, which is what me and my younger brother, 3 years younger than me, had wanted for years, was to go back to public school. We were raised in a neighborhood, and there was, a bunch of boys all our age. Between me and my brother's age, there was probably 7 or 8, 9 boys that we just all, ran around together, rode our bikes together, built forts out in the woods, and did...
You were the gang.
Things that the boys do,
That's right.
Yeah. And so we were always the 2 odd guys out, because this was in the late 70s, and the hairstyles, that was required at school was very short hair. And I can assure you that in the 70s and the 80s, short hair was not in style.
Right. That was not the way to go. Right. So you stuck out like a sore thumb, I bet. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we were always, the butt of jokes and stuff like that.
Sure.
And then being a horrible student, I think this was in the 6th grade, that the last day of school, every year, it was always a stress about whether or not I was going to pass. So I would do terrible all year. And then the last month, I would kick it into high gear, and like, sometimes I would win awards for the most improved and, stuff like that, because I was, so it was a typical year just like that. And I
Right.
was, kicking it into high gear, and but I was always concerned that maybe I didn't start that recovery process soon enough.
Right.
And so last day of school, all of the kids are going up to get their report cards, and my last name starts with W. So I was usually third to the last,
Sweating bullets.
sweating bullets. And all of the other kids went up and got their report cards, and they, teacher's desk was at the front. When it was my turn, I went up there, and now I'm 13 years old. And he filled out the front of the report card, flipped it over, and there was 2 boxes, passed or failed, and he checked failed. And I just remember I just spontaneously broke into tears. And I don't know if you can remember what it was like in 6th grade and 7th grade, and girls and, crushes and things like that. But I was instantly...
Everything's weird.
Yeah.
Everything's awkward. It's the last thing you want is to be embarrassed.
Right.
Publicly, yeah.
Right.
In fact, this is something we touched on, Mitch and I touched on, which was the second to last interview I did.
Right.
It's just a terrible time.
Yeah,
I feel like for everybody.
Yeah.
In fact, if you had a good time, what's wrong with you? Like, no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't repeat those years for
sure.
any amount of money. But I went back to my desk, and I didn't know what else to do. Now I'm crying because I'm crying, because I can't stop crying.
Right.
And I just put my head down on my desk and just tried with all my might to stop crying. So, my introduction into drugs and alcohol, I'd actually been introduced to alcohol that summer by my best friend on my birthday, my 13th birthday. I got drunk as a skunk, and so that was really kind of a perfect storm. My parents were splitting up. I had just failed school. I'd just been publicly humiliated. And I went home that day and decided that I was done. I mean, as long as I can remember, I had been following Jesus. I wasn't just a passive attender. I mean, I loved Jesus. I was following Jesus. And I come to the conclusion that this was doing me no good whatsoever. This had only ever brought heartache and pain. And I decided that I was going to follow a different path at that point. And I remember getting my Bible out of my backpack and taking it to the fireplace and burning that Bible in the fireplace, because I was done.
Yeah, that is a pretty profound thing for a 13-year-old to be going through. I mean, just so many things at once. It sounded like it kind of felt like you just fell off the precipice. And
Right.
So what kind of trajectory did this set you on for your high school years? Was there kind of this, how did you handle all of those changes? I mean, those are some massive changes, kind of losing, giving up on your faith. Your parents are splitting. You're publicly humiliated. You don't like the school that you're attending anyways. You're going back to public school. I mean, these are massive changes all hitting you at once. And so how did you process that at that point, other than, what you just shared with kind of just renouncing your faith?
Well, for me, when I renounced my faith, it was like, okay, this is kind of a new beginning, that now I'm open to new experiences that I never would have been open to. And so part of that perfect spiritual storm that I talked about happened just like maybe 2 weeks later, where I went around we lived by an elementary school, and we would always ride our bikes over there. And I rode my bike around the back, and there was a group of my friends standing in a circle. And that usually doesn't mean anything good.
Right. That's not a good sign. Right. Crop circles and circles of teenagers.
Right.
Like neither one you want to see.
Right. And so I rode up to see what they were doing, and they were smoking a joint. And I can remember vividly my first reaction was, that's drugs, It's like, what are you guys doing? This is drugs. But I'm pretty sure that I partook with that, So that resistance was very short-lived. I don't know if it was peer pressure or Well, I mean, I wasn't being pressured to smoke, not that I can remember, but that was the last part of that perfect spiritual storm. So the first time that I got high was like the first time I got drunk. I was terrified. I was sick as a dog when first time I got drunk. And the first time I got high, I thought, I didn't know if I was going to survive it,
Right.
you know? But then I did. And I can remember waking up because I wound up kind of passing out because I was high and I was hallucinating and I just, I just didn't know. I'd never experienced anything
Right.
like that. And I remember waking up and feeling normal and thinking, oh my gosh, I want to do that again,
Right.
And so that was really, from that point on, I just loved getting high. I loved getting drunk. I loved, even when I was a kid, I can remember when I went to the dentist as a little kid to get my teeth cleaned. I loved the laughing gas. And I remember asking the dentist for the laughing gas, even just to get my teeth cleaned. He's not drilling or anything like that. And they would give me the laughing gas. And I loved it because I loved that feeling
Of
of getting high.
disassociation.
Yeah.
Now, do you think, not to go too far off, off on a side tangent here, but do you think, not that either, and again, let me just preface this by saying neither one of us are medical professionals.
Right.
Do you think that it was like a natural disposition that you genetically had to wanting to kind of craving that feeling? Was there any family history, anything that kind of would point to like, okay, now that looking back on it, especially as you're describing it, going back so early in your life, was there any maybe there's a different aspect of this than just behavioral?
Right. It definitely does run in my family. Both of my grandfathers had problems with alcohol. Now, neither one of them ever professed to be an alcoholic or anything like that. And ironically, both of them quit drinking when they met Jesus. So they had encounters with Christ, and that they, turned their lives around and went on from there. So I do believe that it runs actually on both sides of my family.
You mentioned that, like I hear stories about my own grandfather. I don't know how much of it was. I don't know enough about it to really declare, like he was an alcoholic or anything like that. But he was definitely running around. I definitely heard all kinds of stories about him, and
Right.
and a lot of laughing and at family gatherings and stuff like that. That like when he found Jesus, it just turned. And man, I like when I hear stories about that, especially when I hear about like what you just described, where it sounds like, hey, there's a pretty strong probability that they were alcoholics, and then they just turn face.
Right.
And doesn't that, to me, that sounds incredible. I'm like, how does that happen? Because it took me 12 years to get sober, and the recovery program I was attending was in a church. Like,
Right.
you know what I'm saying? So like, it should have been like, I should have had a leg up, and instead it was this long drawn out process.
Right.
And so doesn't that just kind of strike you as like, man, that's insane. That's crazy that it was just that quick.
It does. I think a lot of it has to do with how much pain we're in when we get here. You know, whenever I see new people and I see them hurting, obviously my heart goes out to them, and I feel bad for that they're hurting as bad as they are. But I very frequently will say, man, this pain that you're going through, it's actually a blessing. You just can't see it right now. But recovery is one of the hardest things that I've ever done.
For sure.
And I was fortunate because when I first started going to recovery meetings, somebody told me that this will be the hardest thing you'll ever do. And I'm grateful for that because it kind of set the stage. It kind of set the bar in my mind that, okay, this is going to be tough. Nobody joins the Marines thinking that it's going to be a walk in the park. They know that this is going to be tough. So they're kind of mentally prepared for that level of toughness or that level of pain that they have to endure. And so that is frequently one thing that I will tell guys that I work with today is that this will be the hardest thing that you ever do.
It's the most worthwhile thing
It is.
I've ever done. And because everything else in my life has flowed out of my recovery and, and really flowed out of the surrender of any control, any illusion of control that I thought I had. And but to get back on track, so you have this experience with getting high for the first time, and is this something that picks up pace pretty quick, or is it kind of a gradual kind of slip into that? I mean, how does this how does this proceed through your high school years and the young adulthood? What does that look like for you?
Well, it was, I'm not sure when this started to take hold, but it was pretty much my primary activity, especially through high school. It was. I would say if there was any ramp up period, it was due to lack of availability, lack of money, when you're 13, 14, 15 years old.
Sure.
I actually started working when I was 14 years old, and I had a job that at that time was making good money for somebody who didn't have any bills and could,
Right.
spend their money on nothing but weed or beer or whatever,
Right.
So it was really, my using was probably really only limited by the access to it. But by high school and certainly by my adult years, I was pretty much off to the races.
So you graduated high school. Did you go to college?
I didn't. I was in high school and I was dating a girl, and she ended up getting pregnant. She was 16 and I was 19 when we got married, and because we were expecting a child. I actually didn't go back to school until well into my recovery. And then I didn't graduate college. I went back and discovered that, boy, that terrible student thing, it's still a thing.
I didn't grow out of that at all. Yeah.
And but I mentioned that I'm an obsessive learner, so I do love to study. I love to learn, and so I chose the path of going down, getting technical certifications and things like that. So I was able to direct my own learning, figure out what I needed to know, go pass a difficult exam, and that was enough to get me into a pretty good career.
And what career did you? I don't know if I ever asked you what you did for a living.
Yeah, technology, IT.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. So it's a pretty big again kind of marking a lot of big things that seem to you seem to stumble upon in these pivotal points in your life. I mean, 19 is again another big transition time. You're graduating high school, you're facing adulthood, and now you've got a wife and a child on the way. Would you like to expand on that, or maybe talk us through what happens next?
Yeah. So my wife, it was funny because when I was 18, I decided to go on a hitchhiking tour across the country, and I ended up hitchhiking down to Florida. I hitchhiked down to Kentucky the first time, and then came back, and then hitchhiked down to Florida the second time, and came back. And I can't remember which one of those trips that I met her on, but I knew her brother.
Okay.
And I got dropped off at the exit very close to where he lived, because he actually lived right next door to his mom and dad. And so I went up hoping to find a ride home, and knocked on the door of his mom and dad, and my future wife answered. It was a Sunday. She was all dressed up, ready to go to church. She was a church girl, and the part of the heathen was played by me.
Right.
And so that's actually how we met. I knocked on her front door, and so we started dating. And for whatever reason, her parents didn't like me.
I can't imagine.
I can't imagine what this young guy comes up with a backpack and looks like he's been rode hard and put away wet. And
is this just the plot to Footloose? Like,
yeah. So it was there was. I was not well received in those early days. We ended up, obviously getting married, as I said, and so that changed through the years, particularly after I got into recovery. But at that time it was she was a church girl, I was a partier, and I remember after she got pregnant, we decided that we were going to get married. One of the things that I always wanted to be was a dad. So the idea of having a baby, even though it wasn't ideal circumstances, I was excited about it.
Sure.
And remember the night before we got married, we went to a restaurant, and she knew that I drank and she knew that I smoked weed. She really didn't know much else as far as drug use. And I remember telling her that I was a very high functioning drunk and druggie. I always had a job, always managed to get to work. In my mind, if I couldn't get to work, that meant that I had a problem. So I got to work come hell or high water.
Right.
There was nothing that was, I'd be throwing up in the bathroom at work from a hangover, but I got to work, by God, and that meant that I didn't have a problem.
Isn't it crazy what denial does to us? Right. It's just like right. I'm going to show you it'll have a problem.
Right, right, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember driving to work. It was a 45-minute drive, having to pull over on 275 3 different times, open up the passenger side door and puke out the car, but I still got to work. And so
you're like, nailed it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so whenever somebody says, oh, this is just a problem of willpower, that's some pretty strong willpower,
right,
to muscle through. I mean, I had dry heaves by the time I got to work, and I still went to work.
Right.
So it's not an issue of willpower.
Right. So when you found out, you're expecting and you got a child on the way, did that temper your using it all, or did it ramp up? Because it seems to be, in most circumstances, when you have a huge life changing event, especially kind of when you're still, and I would say you're still fairly new in your using career, for lack of better terms, it kind of seems like people either go one way. They're like, okay, I'm going to try to do better, like I can't do this, or it's like I'm off to I'm off to the races. I was off to the races guy. And so neither one tends to be healthy. And it always tends to be in the same place. But how did that affect you, or did it affect you at all?
Well, so I was going back to the restaurant with my soon to be wife. The next day we were getting married. I told her that I don't have a problem with this. I like getting high, and I've gotten high for, at that point, probably 7, 8, 9 years, however long it was, and that I was going to do this, and it wasn't a problem. And if she had a problem with it, it's kind of speak now or forever hold your peace. Maybe we shouldn't get married if you can't, accept that. So you can imagine the position that I put her in, a scared 16-year-old pregnant girl, bad relationship with her parents, eager to get, escape that situation, and I lay that on the table. So what else would she say but sure,
Right.
And so that was a discussion that I would bring up probably hundreds of times in the years to come. In terms of whether my using ramped up, my using seemed to always be limited by my availability to money and to, weed or booze or, whatever. I was kind of an equal opportunity user, if all somebody had was Quaaludes, we did Quaaludes that night, but my preference was marijuana and booze. Those were my 2 primary things.
So clearly, for those of us that are in recovery and we're kind of hearing this and we're thinking this can't go well. This is because we, all of us in recovery know that the whole sorry, I'm blanking here. The whole tension in living life in life's terms is that you can't do the things that you just described doing and be a father and a husband and all these. Something has to give. You've only got so much capacity as a human being. So what does that look like moving forward for you?
Well, using kind of edged out everything in my life. Like I said, I always wanted to be a dad. It was the happiest day of my life when my daughter was born. I can remember that like it was yesterday. The birth of both of my children, I can remember like it was yesterday. So those were tremendous times. because of the using, and because her having a church background and me having kind of an ex-church background, but now being, pretty much a drug addict, it caused a lot of tension between us. And
Sure.
so there was a lot of fighting. I mean, there's a lot of fighting in new marriages anyway, but
Right.
when there's drugs and alcohol involved, boy, it's really up to a different level. And so I really believed at that point that she was the problem. She's the reason why my life is unmanageable. And so about 2.5 years, we did have one separation in there. But about 2.5 years in, we kind of both came to the conclusion that this is not going to work. And if this is not going to work, it's best to end it before our daughter gets old enough to where she would really be hurt in a divorce process. She was 2.5, So we decided to end our marriage, and we both went our separate ways. And at that point, having the real problem out of my life, or at least I thought, I was off to the races. I didn't
Sure.
have anything holding me back outside of, finances were still kind of the limiting factor. But in terms of hanging out with my friends, or, going to do whatever, or staying out all night somewhere, I mean, all of that, I could do all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Your time constraint was
the time constraint was wide open. Yeah. Other than a job, I always worked, always maintained a job and income.
to make sure you don't have a problem.
Because that was the determining factor of whether
That's
I had
right.
a problem or not. So I was off to the races, and I was astounded as month 1 and month 2 and month 3 went by, and month 4 went by into my newfound freedom, why things were getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I could not figure this out. I thought that my problems were behind me, and I was sinking to new lows of things that, we've all got those things. I'll never do this, or I'll never do that. And I just felt like I was just crashing through those barriers, one after another. And I could just see that it was a bad trajectory. And I remember sitting, and I was a chronic drunk driver. I would always drive back in the back roads, and I'd get drunk. Usually I was partying with friends. If there was no friends, I would just go out and party in my car, And how I escaped a DUI is just purely an act of God, But I remember being parked one night. It was a full moon. I can remember it vividly, and just looking up at the moon, and I'm got a bottle of whiskey, and and I'm smoking weed, and I remember thinking that as far into the future as I could project my life, I just didn't see it ever getting any better. And I didn't know what to do. I guess I was probably suicidal, but I didn't want to commit suicide because of my daughter. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to put that on my daughter, having a dad that had committed suicide. So I come to the conclusion that it would be better if I just died in some kind of a reckless way, So I started living very reckless. And remember, I went backpacking, drove down to the Smoky Mountains by myself, and went backpacking, and went to some of the worst campgrounds. There's you can get some permits to camp in the backcountry, what they call, and they've got some sites, and you have to register for these sites. And I looked up the sites that had the highest bear sightings, and that's where I went. And I remember filling out a form saying that I had food storage containers, which I didn't. And so I was just kind of on almost a suicide mission. And then I thought, well, I'm just going to drink myself to death. And then shortly after that, I come to the conclusion, well, that's going to take too long.
Right. It's harder than it sounds. Right.
Right, exactly. And so shortly after that, I come to another kind of epiphany, which was that I think I'm going through such a hard time because I'm probably not grieving the loss of my marriage and my family, and now being an absentee dad, and stuff like that. So I come up with the idea that I needed to quit all drugs and alcohol for 2 months because I concluded that I was using drugs and alcohol to stymie that emotional process that would normally take place. And I was so convinced that that was the answer that I told everybody that that's what I was going to do. I told the people that I worked with, I told friends, family, buddies that I ran around with, and I was a little offended that it was received with some level of skepticism. I didn't think that was called for.
Because you don't have a problem.
No, I don't have a problem.
Yeah.
I'm able to go to work every day.
That's right. You keep saying that, Darrell.
I went years without ever missing a day's work, So when that day came that I set in my mind that I was going to get, for 60 days, I wasn't going to use any drugs or alcohol whatsoever. It never occurred to me that even though I'd been using for like every day straight for 10 years, that it might be hard to stop drinking and to stop using.
Yeah.
And so the first day I woke up, I was hungover and I found a half a joint in my pocket. And everybody knows you can't quit smoking weed with a half a joint in your pocket. And plus I was hungover. And so I thought that would help my hangover, which was always my number one hangover remedy, by the way, was getting high. And I can't ever remember it helping, but in my mind, that's what you did, when you was hungover. And, so I ended up smoking that joint, and I come to the realization that, man, I've got a real problem. And the problem is not that I can't quit. The problem is that if I don't quit, now that I've told the world that I'm going to quit for 60 days and they're taking bets on me whether or not I can do this, now if I don't quit, they're going to think I'm a drug addict and an alcoholic. And I can't have that. So my next brilliant move was, well, I've heard of these NA meetings, and whatever these people do to stay clean and sober for the rest of their life will probably work for me for 60 days.
Sure.
And so that's
reasonable, rational conclusion.
Exactly. And so that's what I started going to meetings. And I thought, well, I'm going to, and I tell you, the desire to get high was just nearly unbearable. I wanted to get high so bad, and I wanted to drink, and I just knew that if I did, I was going to prove to the world that I had a problem, and that was the last thing that I wanted to do. And so I determined that I was going to do whatever they told me to do, because obviously this works. I could see that it was working. I had an uncle that had gotten sober in AA, and so I knew how this worked, sort of. I knew that it did work. Let's put it that way. And so at one point, somebody told me to go to 90 meetings in 90 days. So I thought, well, I'm going to be here for 60 days. I'll go to a meeting every night. And so I did that. Somebody told me to hit my knees in the morning and ask God to keep me clean and sober just for today. And even though God and I was on the outs, I did that. Because ironically, even though I kind of walked away from my faith, I was never able to escape the idea that there had to be a God. It was the only explanation that made sense about why anything at all exists. Why would anything exist if there, unless there was a God?
Right.
So I knew that there was a force or something. I didn't know what it was, but I had pretty much rejected Christianity. But I got on my knees and I started asking God to keep me clean and sober. And then one day at a meeting, I heard a guy say that working the steps relieved his desire to use. It removed the obsession to use. So I thought, well, then that's the next thing I need to do. So I sat down at my mom's kitchen table because I was separated. I was living with my mom at that time. And I decided I was going to work the steps. So I sat down and started working step one, and I thought about that, and I thought, okay, no, I can accept step one. This is pretty unmanageable, Step two, I thought, well, yeah, that means that we believe that there's a God. And it's like, well, I believe that there's something. I didn't know what it was, but I believe that there was some force. Step 3 was a little harder because that took me back to my upbringing. And when I can remember in church, people getting up on stage and saying that God had called them to the mission fields and they were going to move to Zimbabwe or someplace like that and be missionaries.
It's like my greatest fear. Like I told Mitch when I got sober, I was like, listen, man, like this whole giving up my control over my sobriety is one thing. But I'm telling you, man, like if I wake up and God's like, you're going to be a youth pastor in Uganda, I'm out. Like I'm done.
Right. And that was a real concern for me too. That was a very real concern. It's like, man, I don't think I'm ready to do that. And this is probably one of those times where the Holy Spirit showed up, even though I didn't know that that's what was happening. But I remember at some point coming to the conclusion that if God wanted me to be a missionary in some godforsaken part of the world, that he would probably put that on my heart, and that would be the thing that I would want to do more than anything else. And so based on that thought, I thought, you know what? Okay, I can turn my will and my life over to the care of God. And so that was all one afternoon. I worked through steps 1, 2, and 3 one afternoon. In the book and Narcotics Anonymous basic text, it says that, we worked the 4th step with a sponsor. So it's like, well, I guess I need a sponsor. So I went to a meeting, asked a guy to be my sponsor, said I've worked through, steps 1, 2, and 3 already, and I need, somebody to kind of coach me how to do this step 4. And he wasn't quite as convinced as I was that I had thoroughly worked through steps 1, 2, and 3 in one afternoon.
I mean, you can't in one afternoon. Seems reasonable.
So he wanted me to go back to step 1. Now I'm only going to be here for 60 days, so I don't have a lot of time for a lot of tomfoolery with this stuff. We need to get the ball rolling. And so I tried to convince him that I had really thoroughly worked step 1, 2, and 3, that I had a real solid understanding of it, and he didn't seem to be buying it. So I did what I thought anybody would do in that situation. I fired him as a sponsor, and I got a new sponsor. And I know this is a tight-knit fellowship, and so I wasn't sure maybe the first guy had been talking to the second guy or how this came about, but it turned out the second guy had the same idea that the first guy had, is that I needed to go back to step 1. So then it became my goal to convince this guy, because now I know, okay, I can't just keep firing sponsors and getting new ones. So it was my goal to convince him that I had worked step 1. And in the process of trying to convince him that I worked step 1, the nearest I can figure is that I must have worked step 1, because
I was going to say, I've never seen somebody accidentally work a better program than what you just described.
Yeah, it was so much effort into doing things the wrong way that somehow something right happened. And so at some point, and I really can't remember, it wasn't like a sudden, beam of light that showed up, but gradually over time, I really fell in love with the idea of recovery, because once I had, a few weeks underneath my belt, I started to see life differently. It was like there was a fog that I had been in, and that fog lifted, and all of a sudden, I don't know, it's like, it's like the tornado picks up the house and drops it on the witch, and then everything's in color, Mm-hmm. And it's like everything was clear to me. And I started looking at some of these things that I thought were my problems, and they looked ridiculous to me. Mm-hmm. And so, and then I start making friends in recovery, and I start enjoying going to meetings.
You're in trouble now, buddy.
Yeah. And so I fell in love with recovery.
Man, that's amazing. I got to say, listening, like I've heard some of your story. I've heard your testimony at CR, and the things that you've shared in group. And I can't say that I came into recovery the same way you did, but a lot of the things that you've described are almost so strikingly similar to the experience that I've had in my own that one, it's the exact reason why I started doing this podcast, because it's those moments that are just so recharge. It just centers you in a way that is you understand the meaning behind why recovery is such a fellowship based
Right.
endeavor. I mean, you can't do it on your own. And like everything from when you were describing when you were describing where you were at with your faith when you started, we were like, God and I were on the outs, but I still couldn't shake him. Like,
Right.
and that's exactly where I was. I remember sitting in this beat up old minivan that I used to drive around, and I've got 6 or 8 month old daughter of my own, and just like I was like, I got to figure out whether you're real or not, and because basically I was ready to give up on any idea of recovery. But to do that, I had to give up on any idea of God, because I couldn't look at guys, and you were one of the people I thought of. It was Randy, Carol, Bob, and you. Mm-hmm. You were the 4 people that I thought of that I'm like, I know their stories. I know what they've shared, and I just know that they're not like, I know it's not bullshit, for lack of better phrase. And I'm sorry for the coarse language for those listening, but I was like, I just know that they're telling the truth, and I know there's no way they could do that without a higher power. And so if I'm going to give up on any idea of sobriety, I have to give up on God. And I just could not do it.
Right.
Could not do it. I'm like, there are things that I cannot explain. And I don't care how cynical you are. There's a certain point with your cynicism that you have to step into a realm of denial. If I feel like, in right. Personal anecdote, and I don't want to push anybody away who's in a different place or doesn't believe in the same higher power. But to me, in my mind, I came to my own realization, or my own determination that no matter how cynical you are, you can take to the point of denial. I feel like right. If you're going to completely deny the existence of some higher power somewhere, because I don't know, man, I look around humanity and I'm like, as good as we think we are, I right. feel like we're stumbling around most of the time.
Right.
and just like you described, you're coming into sobriety, like for all of the wrong reasons that you just right. described, going in and starting sobriety, and how it worked out.
Right.
Like I said, I've never seen somebody accidentally, but for the wrong reasons, start doing something and it work out the right way more than what you just described. It's amazing, man.
Right.
And how can you deny our higher power when you describe what you just described?
Right. Well, the thing of it is I was trying to escape this desire to use. And so I had a very clear goal. It was really just my timeline that was I wasn't telling anybody how I'm only going to be here for 60 days, but the whole time in my mind, that's all I was going to be here. And that whatever you guys are doing, because it didn't take me long to discover some of the people that you were just describing, is that, okay, I could see that, I could hear their stories, and I could see that this was something that had been dramatic,
Right.
And I don't think anybody can really get away from the idea of God. We can convince ourselves, denial is a pretty strong thing, and it works in a lot of different ways, and we can delude ourselves to thinking that there's no God. But, Solomon, 4,000 years ago, however long ago Solomon lived, said that God has put eternity in the hearts of man. And that's the best explanation that I can come up with as to why I couldn't shake him. Is because I just intuitively knew, if you've ever looked up at a starlit sky, where did this come from? Yeah,
and just chuckling at and not in a judgmental way, in a way that honestly comes out of a place of amazement and what God can do with things that we do not intend to work the way that he ends up working them out with, but I mean, you're going through, as you're describing, going through steps 1, 2, and 3, and you're like, I'm good, and I'm like, I'm listening, and knowing that you're setting this stage of like, I'm still in denial. Like, I don't have a problem. Like, man, I was going to work. Like,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And so you start to change. And at this point, was there a moment, you said you kind of had that moment of like, everything all of a sudden is in Technicolor.
Yeah.
And I had that same experience, and I think I shared it in one of the previous episodes. For me, it was, as I'm getting sober, I'm still pretty shaky, still living. I mean, I was breaking it down way smaller than one day at a time. I was moment to moment, phone call to phone call, really. And I remember a couple months in, I'm driving and I'm with my kids, and it's just me and my kids, and windows are down, and I'm bumping some cheesy pop music that they like to dance to, and they're just jamming, and we're singing, and we're just having a good time. And I had this moment where I'm like, there's nothing wrong right now. Like, there's no crisis. There's no other shoe to drop. Like, I've lived my whole life with this dread of waiting for that other shoe to drop, and there's no other shoe to drop.
Right.
Like, I can enjoy this moment for what it is. And it sounds like you started to experience that. And it was that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of when recovery really took hold in your life. That's when the roots really started to grow deep. And
Yeah, it did. It was because I tell people that I started to see the 12 steps as God's blueprint for life. I mean, this was how we get through the things that we're struggling with. This is how we take a searching and fearless moral inventory, and then we share that with someone, and then we use that inventory and we go through and work steps 6 and 7, where we're starting to address these reoccurring character defects and shortcomings that are now becoming pretty, crystal clear, from our inventory. And then we're able to start branching out and start making amends and trying to, repair some of the past, and then, continuing to grow along spiritual lines. And then I've always had a heart to help people anyway. So I was really grateful in the beginning. My sponsor had me doing 12-step work with him pretty early on. I can remember going to, shaky drunks and getting them down to the cat house and, Cincinnati and stuff like that. And that, I tell you, there's just no underestimating the impact that some of those things have. And then when you're seeing people's lives have been transformed, it's just all of the evidence that I needed to see was right there. I felt like I had found God's blueprint for life.
so how far into that your predetermined 60-day term did you go from I'm here for a good time, not for a long time, to I'm going to be here for a long time because I'm having a good time? Like,
Right.
when was that? How far into that 60 days did it take for you to be like, I'm doing this? Like, I think this is something that I need in my life.
I don't know if I can remember what that was. Everything seems so gradual when I'm looking back on it. And I can also say that everything seemed, while there was hope and there was, the Technicolor vision and stuff like that, there were still a lot of hard things that I was dealing with because, we generally don't get here on a winning streak. And I didn't get here on a winning streak by any stretch.
Let it be noted, by the way, that is my favorite thing that I've ever heard in CR, and I love that. When first time I heard you say that, I was like, that is the most. We hear a lot of isms and a lot of cliches, for lack of a better word. They're cliches for a reason, and they're all true.
Right.
But that is my favorite one. I'm like, that if any saying I've ever heard in a recovery program should be on a T-shirt, that's it right there.
Nobody gets you on a winning streak.
That's right.
Yeah. So there was a lot of pain as well.
Sure.
But today, as I'm recounting it, the pain is not the thing that comes to mind. I have to kind of remind myself that that was a painful thing, and I think that's where working with new people is so effective, because I can remember that pain when I'm seeing it in the face of someone else. And when we're talking through the very same things, when I'm talking to a guy and he's convinced that his job is a problem, or his marriage is the problem, or his, neighbors are the problem, or, pick a problem. And you think that if I could just get this one thing or these 6 things straightened out, that life would be better. and it's just not. It's an illusion. It's like you're in the desert and you're thirsty and you're chasing a mirage, and the mirage is going to lead you everywhere but where you need to go. Recovery is an inside job.
For sure.
And it has to happen from the inside out.
So as you're working the program and you're embracing it, really, as even gradually as you're describing it, was there any point during that working with your sponsor that your marriage kind of your separation, obviously, I'm sure was a big topic, working through things. Mm-hmm. Was there a point where maybe it was encouraged to reconcile, or because obviously you had to come to the point of amends at some point? I think were you in NA at this time?
Yeah, I was in NA, and to be fair, I really did not properly work through all of the steps until I had a relapse. And so when I relapsed and I came back, I was kind of for that first 9 months in recovery, I was kind of on the pink cloud.
Sure.
There's just nothing but hope, and even though there's pain, there's still a lot of hope, and I see hope everywhere I look. But I don't remember really ever talking about reconciliation with my sponsor, but the way that reconciliation came about was that I was just in love with recovery, and I was always talking about recovery, and I was going to go to this event, and I was going to go to that event, and these people at this meeting and my friends over here. And, and I remember I was dropping my daughter off to my ex-wife or soon to be ex-wife. And I was describing this and describing what was going on. And I was excited. I was excited about life. And she made the comment, she said, it's a shame you didn't find this years ago. We might have actually had a chance. And I remember that was the first time that I really, that question, that I even entertained that question, that, wow, could it have been my using? I really didn't think it was the using. Now, she would tell you it was absolutely the using, but I would shut her down with that discussion that we had the night before our marriage every time. So at some point, when you keep getting shut down on the same thing, you just finally stop saying. So I really legitimately didn't think that it was my using that was the problem, even into recovery. It wasn't really probably until maybe that moment that I started thinking about that. Well, then it was maybe just a few weeks later that she called me, and she said that she wanted to start taking our daughter to church. Now, my church background was very conservative, fundamental Baptist, King James only, really strict Baptist. Red hymnal, yeah. Her background was Pentecostal. And so if you're familiar with church denominations, those two don't really mix well.
Yes. Yeah, I am very familiar. Pentecostal kid right here, for sure. Yeah.
So my only experience with a Pentecostal church was when we went she wanted to have our daughter dedicated to the Lord. Mm-hmm. And I agreed to that. And it was at her church, was a Pentecostal church. And that was the first time that I'd ever seen anybody speaking in tongues or, any of the running around and hooping and hollering and stuff that you sometimes see in a Pentecostal church. And it alarmed me. I didn't know. I had no reference for this. I didn't know what this was. I was raised in church. I never even knew that this was. I thought speaking in tongues was cussing. I didn't know I didn't even know what speaking in tongues meant,
Right.
And so I just, I didn't want her going to a Pentecostal church.
You're like, it's not a church, it's a psych ward.
Well, I mean, at that time, I don't have any frame of reference.
Sure,
and
right.
I'm not really actively, and I'm walking with Christ. I've had a spiritual experience, but I still haven't met Jesus at this point.
I'm sure that was a massive culture shock.
Right.
You're
Oh,
right.
yeah, it was. It was. And so, and she informed me, well, she wasn't going to take her to a dead Baptist church. And I said, well, I don't care if you take her to a Baptist church or not. So the idea that I came up with was, why don't we find a non-denominational church? And if we both like it, just take her there. Because I could see the benefit of my daughter growing up in church. Mm-hmm. I didn't think that it did me any harm. I thought that would be a good thing for my daughter. I didn't have any interest in taking her, but she was willing to. So I thought that was a good thing. So I looked in the phone book, found a non-denominational church. I said, here's one in Milford. Why don't we meet there on Sunday? And if we both like it, just start taking her there. So we got to the church that Sunday, and when we went in, they gave us the brochure, the program that they usually give you, and inside of that was a trifold pamphlet for something called the Family Life Conference, a weekend to remember. And it was a marriage conference. It was a Christian marriage conference. And I opened it up, and it starts talking about God's blueprint for marriage. Now, I just felt like I found God's blueprint for life with the 12 steps. And now somebody's talking about God's blueprint for marriage. And I'm already starting to think about, I wonder if the using was really the thing, that was. So we decided to put the divorce on hold, which was very close to being done by this time, and put that on hold, sign up for this marriage conference, and just give it a shot. And so I went to this marriage conference, and I had a head-on collision that weekend with Jesus Christ, and I've never recovered from that. That was I can remember right where I was sitting in the auditorium. It was on the left side of the auditorium towards the front, and I remember just thinking, this is it. This is the answer. This is the answer to everything. This is the answer to my life. This is the answer to my marriage. This is the answer to raising my daughter. This is the answer to interacting with people in my life that, I didn't always do a good job at. And so I rededicated my life to the Lord that weekend.
So, I mean, that's got to be, it sounds like it was a massively profound experience that you had.
It was.
Where you're at now, so you got your recovery, and what was you feel like you've got God's blueprint in the 12 steps, and now you have this spiritual awakening with Jesus Christ. And I'm assuming those things are an easy merger for you to reconcile those two things and bring those together. What how do things start to progress after that? What are the changes? Because once Jesus enters your life, especially when you're committed to doing something active like working the 12 steps, which in something that Mitch and I discussed in our episode was, I mentioned that to me in my recovery process, the 12 steps feel an awful lot like the discipleship process.
Right.
And so I imagine that things start to change in a profound way, no matter, whether it's gradual or whether it's fast. Describe those things to me if I'm on the mark there, and walk me through that.
Yeah, it was, things did change, quite a bit. We both felt like now that we've got the blueprint, we should give this another try. So we got back together. We started going to church at that church, but I was still very much involved in NA at that point. I was still in NA, and that was really what I wanted to be involved in. I wanted church to be part of it. And I thought church was a value because this was a spiritual program, and here's a spiritual activity that will help this spiritual program. And so that's the way that I looked at it. So my majority of my spirituality was still happening through 12-step meetings and stuff like that. So we got back, together, and it was, life was as good as I can ever remember it, because we had the blueprint, and I remember having the discussion that even if we have to go back to this conference every year to get a refresher on the blueprint, we have the blueprint. We know how marriage is supposed to work. We know how it's designed. God designed it in such a way, and when you use anything that God designed in the way that he designed it, it's going to work, And so we even decided to have another child. We'd never wanted to have another baby because I don't think either one of us really ever thought that we were going to last, But we decided to have another child. Shortly after she got pregnant, I ended up getting injured at work. I cut my hand, cut some tendons. I had to operate and stuff like that. And there was pain medication involved. And of course, I studiously gave the pain medication to my wife, and she was, squirreling it away and giving it to me only as directed and stuff like that. But I discovered that my body really doesn't know the difference between a legally prescribed drug and one that I bought off the street.
Right.
Right. And, as Charlie, my sponsor who just recently passed away, he used to have a great saying is that the beast is in the cage, but the door is not locked, and I would maybe modify that just a bit and say the beast is in the cage, but the door is only locked from the outside. The beast can't get out unless I let him out, and so that pretty much let the beast out. And so I was, before long, I'm peeking around looking in the reflection of the glass, figuring out where she's putting these pills at. And I'm, helping myself to the pills. And of course, one of the other things that you're supposed to do when you're in recovery is tell the doctor that, hey, I'm, recovery. I can't have any mind or mood altering drugs, which I had done. And then he still wrote me a prescription for narcotics. And so I knew that this guy, probably as highly educated as he was, probably didn't know anything about addiction. So I went back and said, Doc, remember I said that, I was an addict and, I've been on this drug for 2 weeks. It's, you need to get me onto something else. I'm still in a lot of pain, so it's got to be good. You got to write scripts for the good stuff, Mm-hmm. And I just played him like a used fiddle and just went back week after week and just started collecting drugs. I'm still going to meetings, but I'm high on these pills. And the breaking point for me was going up and getting my 9-month chip in NA. And I was high on drugs, and I was trying not to act like anything was wrong because I didn't want anybody to catch on. And one of the things that I developed in that short 9-month period of recovery was a conscience.
Mm-hmm. It's pesky, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I wasn't used to that. And so it was really driving me crazy. I knew that this was wrong. I knew that I just didn't have the courage to just come out and just say, hey, man, I've been abusing these drugs and I'm going to stop, as of today. Instead, my brilliant plan was to go out. I'm just going to go out and I'm just going to tie one last good one on, and then I'll come back and reset the clock and fess up. And because I knew that I wanted recovery. I knew that I wanted, to follow Jesus. I had fallen in love with contemporary Christian music at this point. So I had all this music, just listening to all these. I didn't even know there was anything but Southern gospel up until that point, or hymns, And so I knew that I wanted this life. What I didn't know is that one night would take 5 months to play out. And in that 5-month period of time, I pretty much systematically destroyed everything that God had given me in that early recovery time, and so, things, my wife was ready to leave again, except for now she's pregnant. So you can imagine what this did to her. I mean, I just did unspeakable harm to her in those years, because now she's gotten back with me apparently under false pretenses. And if that's not bad enough, now she's expecting. And now there's another baby that's going to be born into this. And so it was a pretty devastating time for her, And I knew it was, and I knew everything was being systematically destroyed, but I was going to quit tomorrow. I'll quit tomorrow. I'll quit. First, I want to go do this thing. I want to go down here. I want to find the guy that had the good acid when I was using, because I fell in love with acid, near the end of my using career. And so there was just one thing after another, and just systematically burning my life to the ground again. So I come home one night. She was 6 months pregnant. She's sleeping. By this time, I'm relegated to sleeping on the couch. When we first got back together, one of the things we did is we went and had a family portrait made. So we've got this big 16 by 20 family portrait up in our living room, and I'm sleeping on the couch, and behind the couch is a big mirror. And then right in front of me where I'm laying, I can see this 16 by 20 color picture, hope and joy in our faces. There's no dark rings around my eyes. My cheeks are not sunk in. I look like I'm alive. I look like, I mean, we just everybody looks happy, you know. And I set up to get a closer look at that. Now I'm tripping acid this night, and it's just, you know, I was just completely wasted. And I got up to kind of set up to look at that, get a closer look at that picture. And I happened to look over to my left and see that mirror and see my eyes, see my face in that mirror. And I couldn't get over the difference between what I was seeing in the mirror and what I was seeing up on the wall that had just happened just a few months before that,
Right.
5 months before that. And I couldn't get over that. I couldn't get over the difference that could take place in that period of time. And then, you know, I believe God was whispering to me because, you know, I remember vividly thinking I've got a pregnant wife in the next room who's heartbroken because of what I'm doing. And I can't stand, I was disgusted by what I saw in the mirror. And that was something broke in me again. And I said, I can't do this. So she got up that next morning. I think I was up all night. And I told her that I was sorry for what I had done, and that I was going to go downtown and try to check myself into the care unit. I used to have care unit hospitals down in Cincinnati back then, and I was going to try to check myself into the care unit. And went down there, and I didn't have any money, and I didn't have any insurance, and so getting into the care unit wasn't going to work. But I remember talking to the lady, the intake lady, and I told her that I had been clean and sober for 9 months and then relapsed. And when we determined that there was no way for me to go in for treatment, she asked me, she said, why, you know, how did you get 9 months clean and sober without treatment to begin with? And I was a little defensive. I said, well, I didn't realize I needed treatment. I just started going to meetings, you know. And she said, well, if that worked last time, why wouldn't it work this time? And I really couldn't argue with that logic. So that's what I did. I started going back to meetings, went back to my home group. I remember going back in and them clapping for me when I came in. That felt a little embarrassing, but it felt good that I had people that loved me and was, you know, excited to see me back. And so, you know, it was rough going in the beginning because I had to go through whatever that withdrawal was that I was, you know, that I had to go through. It wasn't like really severe withdrawal like you'd have with heroin or something like that, but there was withdrawal involved. I mean, It was headaches and nausea and sweats and stuff like that. And, but I come back, and that was January 24th, 1990. And that was the last, that day looking at the mirror. The next morning when I got back from the treatment center that I couldn't get into, that was January 24th, 1990. And I've been clean and sober ever since.
Man, talk about a moment of clarity.
Yeah.
Man, that is so powerful. Holy cow. Man, sorry. I just we got goosebumps. Such a powerful story, man. Thank you for sharing that. That just, yeah. Just, like I said, hearing these stories and hearing these things, man, it reminds me of, and I don't have, you know, I have a little over 2 years, about 2.5 years, but it doesn't take long, as you just described, to kind of find yourself kind of falling back in old behaviors. And, you know, by the grace of God, I don't really think about using anymore, but I tend to find myself losing touch with, like you said, the pain and what brings you back. What brought you into into the halls of recovery to begin with, into these rooms. And, man, I can't help but like, as you're talking about all of these things and you have this moment of clarity and you're thinking, you have that realization of what you're doing to your wife. And that is, that was probably one of the hardest things to face. And in my recovery early on was that realization of the harm that I had caused. And, I want to take a moment and encourage anybody that's listening to this. If you're in your recovery, if you're working, your recovery right now, and you find yourself in that place where you're having to look at what you've done in the eye, especially, I know a lot of 12 steps programs, but in my experience with recovery, it's that step 4 and kind of the next segment in the steps to that is when you tend to lose people. And it's because doing your inventory and staring those things in the eye and really taking stock of the harm that you've caused. And it's not just the harm you've caused, but the harm that's been caused to you. But in my experience, the hardest part has been facing the harm I've caused. That I want you to know that is not something that cannot be overcome. No matter how much harm you have caused and how guilty you are, the beautiful thing about surrendering to, and especially in my experience with surrendering to my higher power in Jesus Christ, is that he makes life even more unfair because you don't get the things that you deserve. And the beauty of the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ is that not only does he wipe those things, our sins away, but at the same time, he has a way of taking those things and turning them on their head and using them for good. So if you're at a place right now where you're struggling with that part of your recovery journey and you're having a hard time staring down your demons and staring down the things that you've done, just know that there's hope, that the same higher power that you surrendered to in step 1 and step 2 and step 3, that same higher power has the power to redeem the things and to heal the wounds that you have caused and to resurrect things that you thought were long dead. So I don't know, I just had this feeling that it was maybe somebody listening to this will need to hear it. And
Right.
I'm sorry I didn't mean to hijack the conversation there for a hot minute, but
it's good stuff. It's absolutely right.
so you go back to working. You go back to meetings. You're working the steps again. I know it's a painful process getting back up on your feet, in your sobriety. How does that process look? How does that look like now? What does that look like moving forward from that point?
Well, at that point, I got a new sponsor, and I got a sponsor that was in AA. My previous sponsor was in NA, although he did go to AA meetings back then too. But I got a sponsor that was in the city where I lived. With getting clean and sober and doing 90 and 90 in NA back then.
I'm sorry. I'm going to turn that air conditioner off real quick.
Okay.
It is so loud.
Yeah.
You're good.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second,
Yeah.
guys. Sorry about that. I should always turn that off, and I forgot. Apologize. Worst podcast ever. I think Darrell's awesome. I'm very fortunate with my guests that they are way better at this than I am. Sorry, please.
No, you're doing a good job.
So please continue, and we'll just pretend that didn't happen.
Right. So I got a sponsor in the town that I lived in, and my AA home group was in Loveland where I lived, and so that was where I got my sponsor and just started working the steps. That's something that I hadn't done. I worked those first 3 steps, but I hadn't done that 4th step, before the relapse. I wasn't necessarily avoiding it. I was still on the pink cloud, but that was the first thing that he wanted me to do, was to get back through the steps. And so we would, I remember sitting in the parking lot of Perkins with him one night and reading the 3rd step prayer, when we got to to that point. There was a Perkins over in Montgomery that used to be like the gathering spot for all of the meetings on Friday night that would let out, and all of the people from all these meetings would go. As my favorite night of the week, because you just got all
Sounds
this.
like a good time.
It was, yeah.
Hey, listen, man, Jesus is in those blueberry muffins.
Right. Yeah, and it was you got to just hang out with your friends and some people that went to different meetings that I didn't get to see that I met there, and
Right.
and then worked through that inventory process. I remember going to his house and sitting on his back deck and reading that inventory, which I was not looking forward to. And but I got through that, and I remember going back home, and I don't think to this day that I've ever felt such a spiritual high that I felt that day. It was like I had been truly released. And I don't know how many cravings I was having before that, but I don't remember having cravings after that. That was one of the things that really, I think, finally set me free from that, because some part of our early recovery is still behavior modification. Right?
Sure.
We have to not go to the bar. We have to not go to that buddy's house, or but at some point in recovery, you have to, white knuckling is part of it, but it can't be all of it, And so I think for me that fourth and fifth step process was the part really where my heart was captured, and I just fell more and more in love with recovery.
Yeah. Mitch told me, again, my sponsor, and check out his episode if you haven't. He told me this about the time I was starting my fourth step, I think, where he said, when you start recovery, the pain and the negative feelings that brought us there will carry you for so long,
Right?
And they'll give you the fuel to white knuckle it for a while as you start those, like you said, behavior modifications and kind of changing your life one action at a time,
Right.
one habit at a time. He said, but it can't sustain you. He said, at some point, the motivation, the fuel that keeps you going has to change from fear and pain to hope. And I think it's, and I say this with no judgment, because I've quit my fair share of step studies right at step 4. It's kind of one of those things where you kind of anticipate as you start a step study, where you hit that step 4 and you're going to lose a good chunk of dudes. And it's now that I've experienced doing an inventory and experienced that same freedom that you just described of feeling that weight lifted. I mean, it's almost like you don't realize how crushing that burden is until it's gone.
Right.
And it's heartbreaking when dudes bail at that moment, because I'm like, man, you don't know how close you are to experiencing that freedom. And I think when everybody that's gone through a step study and gone through that process, we all have this, man, you got to do a step study. Like, you got to do a step study, man. That's where your life changes, working those steps.
I agree.
And I think specifically what we're talking about is I think most of us kind of think to that freedom that we find through the inventory process and then eventually through the amends, which is another experience that you go through where there's, you can find a very cathartic release, sometimes even regardless of how it goes with the other person.
Right.
But I real quick, I do want to ask you, and this is a little random, but so I'm familiar with AA. I've actually never been to an AA meeting. I actually want to go, but Charlie was my sponsor as well for a while, and when he was my sponsor, we actually didn't do the CR steps. He gave me a big book,
Right.
and we went through that, and I never had any experience with AA. I love the big book. I still have it. I still have my copy, and I still the part that I'm very partial to is the back half with all the stories, and it was kind of an inspiration for starting this podcast, to be honest with you. And so is in your experience with both, kind of the big three in my mind, CR, AA, and NA. What is NA? Is NA very similar to AA in terms of steps and things, and as far as how the fellowship is structured?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's the same steps. They put the word "we" in front of all of the steps, whereas AA, I don't think AA uses the word "we."
Hmm.
Their steps don't start in, with
Huh.
"we." People in NA, they make a big deal of that. Maybe it is. I don't know, but I do think it's the core of the 12 steps that gets us.
Right.
That
Right.
basically introduces us to our higher power, who, in
Hmm.
my opinion, is Jesus Christ. When I first started trying to pursue God, I didn't know about Jesus. I didn't know about the Holy Spirit. I didn't know about any of this. I just remember telling God, so you have to be there
Hmm.
because it's the only, reason for anything to exist. Just don't let me believe anything that's not true. And I think that's probably one of the best prayers that I've ever
Man, that
prayed.
is a profound prayer.
And I believe that that's why I'm a follower of Jesus today,
Hmm.
because I didn't really come to my faith in Christ from an emotional standpoint. A lot of people come from an emotional standpoint. I came really more from an intellectual standpoint and thinking about it and researching, the Bible and what that is and stuff like that. So I'm as Charlie used to talk about, was us thinkers, and I used to tell him that if it wasn't for us thinkers, we wouldn't have any bridges or buildings or anything.
Right.
So thinkers play a role in this world, but that's
Yeah.
how I came to faith. The other thing that I do credit NA with is that NA does not focus on a substance like alcohol. They focus on the concept of addiction.
Hmm.
So if you've ever heard me introduce myself, I used to say that I struggle with drugs and alcohol, but more times than not, I'll say that I struggle with addiction,
Hmm.
because addiction was, marijuana and acid and booze and, whatever else that, comes up after that,
Hmm.
So I can get addicted to anything. I
Mm-hmm.
say addiction is always looking for a host, you know.
Right.
So when it's alcohol, then I'm obsessed with alcohol. If it's drugs, then I'm obsessed with drugs. If it's pornography, then I'm obsessed with pornography,
Hmm.
So it's just always looking for a host. And so I credit them for that concept, that they don't make a distinction between, oh, I'm a crack addict or I'm a heroin addict or, I'm an alcoholic or something. I suffer from addiction, and that will manifest itself in any number of hundreds
Hmm.
of ways, because I've got this giant hole in my heart, and all of these things can partially fill that hole. But the fact of the matter is I think that the hole is a God-shaped hole,
Hmm.
and only God can perfectly fill that. So, going back to your comment about, white knuckling it, sometimes, white knuckling it is part of getting clean and sober, but it'll only take you so far.
Right.
And I remember thinking that, there's probably only two ways to do this. I can either spend the rest of my life resisting with all of my might the thing that I really want to do with all my heart, which is to get high, or I can change my heart. And
Hmm.
I don't have the ability to change my heart,
Hmm.
but God does have the ability to change my heart. And so once that heart gets changed, all of a sudden I can release the grip. It's not up to me to hold on to the chair for dear life and try to resist the temptation to use, because that gets removed as a process of working these steps, clearing the wreckage of the past, cleaning up our side of the street, and coming into a relationship with our higher power.
I could not think of a better way to put that. That was great. And thank you, by the way, for kind of indulging my curiosity about NA. It's a goal of mine. I want to attend. So I've attended an OA meeting, Overeaters Anonymous, and I definitely want to. I want to see what else. I kind of view the different recovery programs as, and I hope that I would hope I don't. I would assume, just as human beings, it's natural for there to be some little bit of tribalism or division.
Right.
In my opinion, there should be a cooperative nature between all of
Absolutely.
these recovery programs, because Mitch actually mentioned in his interview where he's like, he's like, I love CR, and he was kind of describing his his engagement with CR. He's like, the one thing that's kind of tough is that there's not always a meeting, and
Right.
he's like, he kind of in his parting words at the end of podcast was like, hey, if you're struggling, there's don't limit yourself to CR. Like,
Right.
there are meetings out there. There's, I mean, literally just about any time at any day, there's an AA meeting going on.
Right.
And I'm assuming NA is very similar. And
Yeah.
so I do want to experience kind of everything. And
I love all three of the fellowships. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for all three of them. And people will say, well, NA is too much of this, or AA is too much of that, or CR is too much of this. And all I would say is that every meeting is different. I've been to CR meetings that I didn't care for, and I've been to CR meetings that I love. I've been to AA meetings that I didn't like, and AA meetings that I loved. So we tend to find what we're looking for, And so if we're looking for the right thing, we're gonna find it. And
for sure.
And I think that, like I said, CR wasn't around when I got clean and sober. So if it hadn't been for NA and it hadn't been for AA, I wouldn't have ever found Jesus Christ, because that was the path that he led me through to lead me back to him. I didn't know that I was going to be sitting in a marriage conference, with how many ever months clean and sober I was at that period of time. I was looking for an answer for my marriage, or to see if there was an answer. So I think that we find what we're looking for.
So to get us kind of back on track with story time,
Okay.
So you find a new sponsor, you start to get engaged with AA. I think it's about where we left off. So
Yeah.
What's going on in your life now? What is the next progression?
Well, that was the time that I was going back to school, and I was,
Okay.
starting to, bought a house when I was like 2 years clean and sober. We bought a house right across the street from where we lived at the time. So I
Easy move.
literally moved from 6554 to 6557.
There
so
you go.
Load up the pickup truck and she'd drive slow and I'd walk behind and hold the stuff, And so we, moved across the street, and, I continued for, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 years. I was very involved in AA. My sponsor used to always come over, and my kids can still remember this. My kids couldn't remember me ever drinking. Well, my son wasn't even born when I was 3 months clean and sober when he was born, but my daughter has no memory of me using. And, but she does have memory of me and my sponsor sitting on the front porch drinking coffee, and so, Don would come over and we would sit on the front porch, and that was a pretty regular thing that we did. I started to get more involved in church. Once the kids got old enough to start teaching, to be in Sunday school, I started teaching Sunday school, and then I got involved with a men's group at church, and then I got involved with Promise Keepers was really big back then, and I
remember that, yep.
I remember going to a Promise Keepers, event, and there's like 65,000 guys in this big stadium singing "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," and I get goosebumps just thinking about that, And so I started to really be more attracted to the church at that point than I was recovery. I was still doing recovery meetings, but step 11 says that we continue to grow along spiritual lines. And so for me, growing along spiritual lines was more natural in a church setting at 6, 7 years clean and sober than it was back then you used to smoke in meetings, than it was in a smoke-filled meeting with a bunch of people, cussing like sailors, And to be fair, I occasionally cuss like a sailor, so there's no judgment on the
Right.
cussing. But there's just one environment that seems more conducive to growing along spiritual lines, and I just started to. Plus, that was where my family was. I was teaching Sunday school, and so I just gradually got more and more involved with church, and to the point to where I wasn't really doing meetings anymore. At one point, I did start going back to AA meetings, maybe about year 10 or 11, and went for 3 or 4 years, but it was really just kind of checking off a box. I was just, doing it because that's what you're supposed to be doing. I was growing and learning more about Jesus and growing closer to him in the church setting. So while I don't think that church is necessarily always the thing that can get you clean and sober, as a matter of fact, a lot of times it's not what will get you clean and sober. It's the 12 steps that will get you clean and sober. But, for me, I just gravitated towards that. Then fast forward to, about 2011, my marriage was falling apart. I didn't realize that it was falling apart until my wife asked me for a divorce one day, and that was the first clue that I had that, hey, this is pretty serious.
That's a rough one. That's right. That's a bad time to get clued in.
Yeah. So I have a history of being clueless, and that was certainly one of those. And so I kicked in to high gear because that's what I do. I focus really well on things when it's important, and so focused all of my energy on trying to save my marriage, and ended up buying a farm out in the country because that was one of the things that she always wanted. I always wanted land, didn't necessarily want a farm, but as it turns out, when you buy a farm, you get land.
Right.
so
not much of a farm without land.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. So it was a good thing. And so we started, we kind of saved, kind of pulled it back onto the tracks for, 3 or 4 years, but then started going south again. And so by 2015, it was pretty clear that my marriage wasn't going to make it. I had put as much effort into that as I had put into anything in my life, and I didn't do it perfectly by any stretch, but I put everything I had into it. And so once it's clear that it's going to end, then I'm finally ready to let go of it. I've been fighting that and not wanting to let it go, wanting to hold on. And so this is really when I came to grips with my codependency, because some of the things that I did, including buying a farm for someone, is kind of a codependent thing to do, About 2011, Andrew, my youngest, turned 21, and he started drinking for the first time. Now, he had been smoking some weed. We'd caught him a few times with weed, but he was in church bands. He was a musician, and he played in junior high and high school and worship groups and stuff like that, and went to Cincinnati Christian University. And he only went for one semester because he kind of took that school gene from me, the terrible student thing, But he was, starting to kind of go down the exact same path that I had been with, kind of being enamored with marijuana and with booze and stuff like that. And so by 2015, when I realized that my marriage was not going to make it, I had heard about this thing called Celebrate Recovery, and I thought about numerous times, I ought to go check that out because that sounds like it's would be right up my alley because, I loved recovery, and now I love church, and now you've got recovery and church. It's like chocolate and peanut butter, there's two things you're supposed to go together,
Right.
And so I started checked out a CR meeting, started going to CR, and midway through 2016 is when my wife finally left. And so then it was just Drew and I that was, living there. And Drew's progressively getting worse with his using and stuff like that. And we're going through a really, really ugly divorce at that point. And so that makes it even harder, I think, for us to effectively deal with our son, who's, clearly having issues. Our daughter had been married and out of the house for a number of years, and she's married and has five little girls. So I'm a grandpa 5 times. But Drew was really struggling, with that, and so Drew ended up losing his battle with addiction in 2019, beginning in April of 2019. So, these are things that aren't supposed to happen, marriages that are miraculously saved at marriage conferences where you come to know Jesus are not supposed to implode, and kids that are born when you're 3 months clean and sober are not supposed to die of the exact same things that you were dealing with. Because ironically, he was a pothead and a boozer just like me, and fell in love with acid at the near the end of his life. That's exactly the path that I had. So for me, the fact that I was already in CR, which what brought me to CR was the divorce. It was the pain of that divorce. I'd never experienced loss like that.
I think that's where you and I met for the first. We
It
were in a
was.
step study
Yeah,
together.
it was. And I remember one of the things I remember about you is I must have shared something because I was in a lot of pain
I remember.
back then.
I was pretty young and stupid back then, but even then, I could see that when you walked in, man, there was
Yeah.
pain.
Oh yeah, it was. And so I must have said something, and response to a question or something like that just kind of gave you a little glimpse of just how much pain I was. And I don't think you and I think we just said hi. We really had never talked. And I don't know if you knew my name, but I remember you saying, kind of stopping the meeting to say, hey, can we just pray for this guy? And all you men, gathered around me, and, of course I'm trying not to cry and not doing a very good job of that. But it's one of my pretty vivid memories of first meeting you, and really one of the many, many healing experiences that I experienced here in this building that we're sitting in, but in the fellowship of Celebrate Recovery as a whole. So it's I can't think of a better place to be when the wheels come off, because you got brothers who didn't even know your name, who are willing to, reach out and, empathize with you and pray for you and stuff like that. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned early in my recovery, loving to do 12-step work. That's why today I firmly believe that CR is my primary ministry, and I don't foresee any change to that. I won't say ever, because sometimes God changes the trajectory.
It's not too late to end up in Zimbabwe.
Yeah. So yeah, there's always Zimbabwe.
That's right.
But no, this is I view CR today as my primary ministry, and I can't, having gone through the loss of a child or the loss of a 32-year marriage. We were married for 32 years when we divorced. We were together for a full 2/3 of our lives. So that's something hard to adapt to, and it would be almost unthinkable to think that you could go through things like that, things like losing a child, and it not have any purpose, that there would be no good that would come out of it. It's just 100% tragedy and no redeeming value whatsoever. And for me, CR is where I find that redeeming value, because there's hurting people here. There's hurting people every week that come in here, and that's why I'm, so active in working with so many guys. I've had to kind of back off, because there's only so many hours in the day. But yeah, if I had unlimited time, this is what I would devote my life to 100%, because this is not only me giving back, but it's actually adding meaning and purpose to some of the tragedy that I've experienced in recovery. And that's exactly how God works. He works through those hard things. And had it not been for the hard things, I wouldn't have ever gotten clean and sober, And if it hadn't been for the hard things in the last few years, I wouldn't be here right now. And today, I love my life. I am truly a completely grateful person for what God has done in my life, because having been in some of those deep, dark valleys, man, it makes you appreciate the mountaintops, you know. It makes you appreciate just not being in the valley,
Right.
and much less the mountaintops. I've had less of those mountaintops experiences, you know.
Well, I mean, I can't think of a darker valley to walk through than to lose your child. And it's one of those things that it's being around recovery, you get to hear people's stories, and death makes its appearance
Oh yeah.
way more often than we'd like. And every time I hear it, whether it's your story or somebody else's story, just the thought of losing one of my girls is enough to make me question whether or not I could get through it.
Right.
And that's just a thought. And as you're reflecting on the loss of a marriage and the loss of a child, I only want to take this as far as you're willing to take it in reflecting on it. Yeah. But obviously I can't even, I'm trying to find the words to even ask you, like, there has to be a point where you're looking at God and you're like, where are you in this? Where is your love in this? Like,
right.
And there's a certain, I don't remember where I heard this, but it stuck with me. And sometimes I want to ask you this: was there a certain point where you had to make the choice, either God's good or He isn't?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. When I've struggled with that even just within the last year or two. So and you know where I came to on that, because there's been times where I've thought, you know, just like I said, this is not supposed to happen. This is not how this is supposed to play out. This is not the logical ending. I'm supposed to get clean and sober, and I'm supposed to enjoy a life of sunshine and rainbows until I peacefully pass away in my sleep one day, you know, at age 95. You know, that's if I was writing the story, that's how it would go, you know. But I know that I've experienced some experiences even recently where I've had to struggle with that, with, you know, is God really good? If He would allow something like that, is he really good? And I know that I can answer that question theologically. I can answer the question that God is sovereign, and, you know, that we have a very real enemy of our soul, and the enemy can shoot very real fiery darts at us, and it can do tremendous harm. But God's able to take those darts, and He's able to somehow bring blessing out of it. And I've experienced that a lot in it's my recovery story. You know, it was a dramatic, you know, dramatic change in my life, that God was absolutely the one that caused that. And so when I'm struggling with, is God really good? Sometimes He doesn't feel good, you know. But in my most recent struggle, I remember thinking about, you know, I was thinking about, is this even worth it? You know, what if I just, you know, went back and started using? I mean, I wasn't tempted to use, but that was one of the options that was, you know, when I asked the question, where next? That was one of the options on the table. And I was reminded of the story in the New Testament when Jesus is, he's gathered all these followers and he's got this big crowd of people that's following him because he's doing these incredible miracles and people just can't get enough of him. But then at one point, he starts talking some really crazy talk. He starts talking about, eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And of course, he's talking about the Passover, which is when he's going to be crucified, but nobody understands that. And this is all crazy talk as far as everybody can tell around him. And they start leaving. And so all of these, thousands of people that are following him, they just start exiting. And at one point he looks at his disciples and he says, "What about you guys? Are you going to leave too?" And Peter says, "Where else would we go, Lord? Who else has the words of eternal life?" And I come to the conclusion that at some times we just don't know what the answer is. I don't pretend to know what the good is that can come out of all of the things that I've encountered in my life. But I know the good that I have encountered came directly from the hand of the Lord, and there's really no second best option that I can find, because there's nothing out there but darkness. And at least with God, at least with Jesus in my life, at least with this program and brothers like you and just dozens and dozens and dozens of guys that I know, at least I have somebody to walk through it with. I don't have that out there. Even if I was just 6 months clean and sober, I wouldn't have that out there because I never had it back then. All of those friendships were superficial, and they all proved to be superficial. I didn't have real friendship until I got here.
So I recently, about a week ago, somebody I used to work with when I did HVAC, who was always one of those dudes that was very encouraging to me. I struggled. There was kind of this sense that because I knew the owner of the company I worked for, I knew his brother, and so that's how I got on, that I didn't earn my way in. I was kind of just handed things. So I spent most of my career kind of fighting that. I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, which for those of you that listening that know me, like, surprise, Matt had a chip on his shoulder. But he was one of those guys that, like, I could always call. He'd always pick up the phone. He'd always help me out. There was no, again, sorry for my coarse language, there was no fuck up too big that he wouldn't come help me out. And there was never a lack of an encouraging word. And towards the end of my time at this company, he transitioned into kind of like a field manager of sorts. And again, kind of still struggling, I'm struggling to kind of get any kind of recognition that I'm any damn good at my job. But he was always there to be like, "Man, you're doing great. Like, if you weren't, I would tell you." And he passed away from cancer at 53. And one of the other guys that I still stay in touch with, he's a great dude, man. And if you're listening to this, buddy, these are all things I've said to your face. He's one of those teeters between agnostic and atheist, I think, and is probably closer to faith than he realizes. He's, what I'm saying? Like, I'm like, man, like, you're so close, and it's just that faith component it's gonna be it's gonna be a tough thing for you. I know, because same thing. And my sobriety and my faith hinged on that. And kind of one of those things where he didn't ask me, but as we're talking about it, I can feel it, because he's asked me before, like, how do you reconcile the God that you serve with these terrible things that happen? I don't know if he's just being nice, or we haven't had much time to talk about it, but I'm sure it'll come up in a conversation. And it's tough, because in my flesh, it's hard for me to look at other dudes that we worked with, to be honest with you, and that I'm like, I would. I'm like, that dude deserves to
Why
get
not
cancer.
them?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm like,
right.
screw that guy. Like,
Yeah.
why is the one like this guy like the nicest guy, one of the nicest dudes I've ever met? Like,
Right.
just universally well liked. Like, even the people that might find a reason not to like him can't deny he's a good guy.
Right.
And he actually went through a divorce when I was left the company, and then got cancer like immediately after
Wow.
and passed. And I've struggled with that this week.
Mm.
I've struggled with that reconciliation a little. Not well. In some ways, yes. I guess I have struggled with the reconciliation of like, God, I don't understand. And and talking to you right now, I to calm down. Talking with you, I can't think of anybody that might understand that struggle more.
Right. Right.
And so that's where I kind of keep coming back to, you're either good or you're not.
Right.
And like kind of going back to it, to hear you talk about it, where like I don't understand, there's things that I don't understand, but I do understand where the good things in my life have come from.
Right.
So it was almost like a little bit of tension left me when you said that, because that's where I've been, and in a much, and if you want to get relative, that's fine, but like in a much lesser degree than what you've experienced, and like I'm kind of still looking at this like I don't understand,
Right.
and that's kind of the place I've been. Like, I don't understand why these things happen, but I know that everything good has happened, and everything that, especially since I've been sober, is by the grace of God. None of it is my doing, other than my willingness to say, I give up. I will do what you tell me to do, but you got to do it.
Right.
And
yeah, for me, it's I mentioned that there's a theological reason, and that's a very real reason why bad things happen. Is that God has given us free will, and He's given everybody free will. He gave He gave my son free will. He was able to do what he wanted, and that was the expression of His love by allowing him to. If anybody's ever been controlled by somebody else, or anybody's ever lived in an oppressive regime where they're not free to go, and they're not free to live their lives, and they're not free to believe things, and they're not free to say things. I mean, that's an oppressive, that's a miserable life, And so freedom is what God gives us, but with that freedom comes the possibility of harm, to take place. And for me, the redeeming quality is that we have a God who's able to take these fiery darts that the enemy's firing at us. And I don't know if you ever see I'm trying to remember which Disney movie this was. It was like Sleeping Beauty, or I think it was maybe Sleeping Beauty, where the Prince Charming is trying to get to the castle, and they're shooting fiery arrows at him and stuff like that. And the three fairy godmothers, whatever their names are, they're like, putting a dome around him, and these fiery things are becoming like daisies, and they're just, falling down.
Yeah.
That's kind of the picture that I have of how God operates with this stuff, except for that they still have a point. The daisy still has thorns in it, and there's still sticks, and it still hurts. But it was pain that got me here. It was pain that introduced me to the blessing that I have today. And so had it not been for that original pain, I wouldn't be here to begin with. And so there's a passage in the Bible, and I think it's in Hebrews, maybe Hebrews 12 or something like that, where it says that Jesus, for the hope that was put before him, endured the cross, and the cross, I couldn't think of a more brutal and just demonic way to be executed than the cross. But he knew what was on the other side of that. And so in the last couple of years, and I just shared this, I think this past Saturday in a meeting here, is that, there's been a number of times in my life where it looked like there was boulders that were just coming at me, and they were going to crush me. And some of them felt like they crushed me. But I've seen it in others, and now I've had the benefit of having gone through it enough to where I know firsthand that on the other side of that crushing is a blessing, because God's going to turn this thing around, and he's taken the worst things that have ever happened in my life, and he's made them my platform. He's made them my ministry, and it's the only reason why I have anything to offer to anybody who walks through these doors, is because of what I have been through. So this is an unfair life. God only gives us knowledge of so much. Deuteronomy says, I think it's Deuteronomy 29:29 says that, that there's only so much that he allows us to know, and the rest of that belongs to him. He doesn't have to tell us what the reasons are. And I don't like that answer.
I don't either.
I don't like it a bit, but I don't like gravity when I fall from too high and I get hurt, or when somebody falls off a building and gets killed, but gravity is necessary for the universe to hold together, so with the blessing is going to come hurt and pain. And for me, I've got a God that is able to take that, and he's able to turn that around into blessings that I wouldn't have ever experienced. Like I said, because it was gut-wrenching pain that got me here 33 years ago when I got clean and sober. And so every one of these things that I've lived through in my life have always produced more blessing over the longer period of time than the heartache, at the shorter period of time. Obviously, losing a child is a little bit different because that continues to go on, but because you never get over that, but you can go forward. And I've discovered a way with the help of other people, because I don't have any original material here. This is, Solomon said, "There's nothing new under the sun," and he was right. So anything coming out of my mouth, I've heard from somebody else. I don't have any original material, but he's used every bit of this. So I'm grateful that he does use it, and that he has used it, and that I'm not currently in a valley. Now, I may eventually be in another valley, but I know what's on the other side of that crushing now, and Jesus knew that, and that's how he was able to go to the cross.
Man, this is part of the reason I was really looking forward to having this conversation with you is that I knew we would probably get into some tough things, into some tough topics that most people aren't comfortable talking about.
Right.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that I'm having this conversation with you after what happened with the guy I used to work with. And man, there's just one more thing, and I feel like we're kind of drawing to close here, and maybe one more topic I'd like to share, not really seeking an answer, but just it's something that's on my mind. And after we kind of get through that, I would definitely want to give you a time to share any last closing remarks to anybody that's listening. But I sometimes struggle with understanding why, like, and I hope this isn't too personal. I don't think it will be, and I appreciate your openness. But why there are times that I look at like, why your son? Why not me?
Mm-hmm.
Why is he not here and I'm here? And why are there people? Because I was even having a conversation, and during the conversation I had with Paul Salazar, where he it was actually after the podcast where he was like, we're kind of talking about my time just before my recovery, and he was a big part of he kind of set some things up, and whether he realized it or not, he was kind of leading me in a direction in the right direction,
right,
towards recovery. I was getting to that point where you had talked about earlier, and when you separated from your wife when you had, like, you were basically like free to go hog wild. Well, that was my 2020. You know, I had unemployment. The unemployment benefits were crazy back then. So I had access and I had time. And I
Right.
was like, if there ever is a time to go for it. This is it. And I did.
Right.
And just like how you found that your life got worse, so did mine. And I realized that, when I entered the step study that I eventually got sober in, I was still using. But I knew that I'm like, I got to do something because I'm going to end up divorced or dead or something. And,
Right.
Paul and I were talking. He's like, I never didn't have faith that you were going to get it eventually. He's like, but there are some guys that don't. There's some guy, and I think he even mentioned that AA even has, kind of speaks to that. And I forget exactly the phrasing used. There are people that just
Constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. Yeah.
and they don't ever get to experience the freedom that comes with recovery and accepting Jesus Christ as your higher power, in my experience. And I struggle sometimes with, like, why me? Because I mean, in my own recovery journey, I overdosed and I should have been dead.
Right.
It was literally, there was no explanation other than God willed it to not be that I shouldn't have died in Norwood in my very first apartment.
Right.
And there have been multiple times since then, and I don't understand. I struggle with like, why, like I don't deserve it. Clearly, I'm no more. I don't deserve the life I have more than your son ever deserved anything or didn't deserve anything. It was never. I struggle with that sometimes, where I wrestle with that, and thankfully, through recovery, it's not so much guilt. It's heartbreak, like sadness, like sorrow. I don't. There's part of me that still my faith is childlike in the sense that I'm like, I don't get it. Like, I just don't.
Right.
I still trust you. I don't get it.
Right.
And I don't think there's an answer anymore that's any better than any one that you've given, because I think that's a great answer of kind of the point where, like, I don't understand the thing, and there's an acceptance of there are things that I'm not going to understand, but I know that all good things come from you. But I even wrestled with bringing it up at the end of this, because I'm like, am I just beating a dead horse with kind of the same, kind of really approaching the same topic again from a different angle? But I don't know. Maybe it's because somebody else is wrestling with it the way I do,
Right.
or the way I have, and maybe for them they do feel guilt. I don't, because I'm thankfully at a point in my recovery where I understand that guilt does nothing for me,
Right.
and especially things that are out of my control. I didn't choose to be saved, but I'm glad. I'm thankful.
Yeah.
It reminds me that the good things in my life are not my own, and when I think about gratitude, which is a topic that God tends to bring up internally with me a lot, I think about you. Because I've heard you mention the gratitude that you live with, and I'm like, and by all accounts, if there's somebody that, in a worldly sense, I guess, if you want to call it that, in a secular sense, and in a logical sense, even in the way that we would think in the confines of this world, if there's anybody that deserves to be bitter, it's probably you, because, like you said, this isn't the way things are supposed to go. And I just want to say that I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for your story. I'm grateful for your openness and your vulnerability about it. And
Well, thank you.
like I said, you were one of those guys that when I could not give up on sobriety and give up on God, because especially hearing your story again, how? Other than by the grace of God, how?
All right.
Not only to survive, but to live life with gratitude. And I guess I want to make sure I take the time to say that if there's any question of the impact that of what God's doing with the pain that you walked in here with, and that you've had to work through, that He's working it, man. I can tell you firsthand that it's had an impact on my life. So
Well,
thank you for
that.
sharing. And if there's anything you want to add about what I just said, I don't know if there's much more to add. But also, I want to open the floor to you for any closing comments, any things that you want to add before we wrap this up.
Right. Well, I guess the only thing that I would add to what you said is that one of the things that I am reminded of a lot is that before I got here, things were bad. And so if things get bad, sometimes now that I'm here, it's not like I left a wonderful life and now I'm suffering in this new, walk with Jesus. It was bad on both sides of the fence. You kind of naturally expect and hope, and for the most part, it is better on this side of the fence, but it's not always good on this side of the fence. But again, I keep coming back to the fact that, there's what's the alternative? What's the alternative to belief? What's the alternative? There was pain on that side of the fence too. So if I go back to that side, I'm just going to have all the pain and none of the solution. At least I've got a solution on this side. At least I've got people that walk with me. When, I've been pretty active in CR in Cincinnati. So I'm active in, a lot of CR groups actually. And, when Drew passed away, it was, I don't even know how many CR people that showed up. I don't know how many CR people it was that, followed up with me and checked in on me and stuff like that. I mean, God gave me this fellowship to get through what He knew was in the path. And the fact of the matter is that we're all going to die. My son just died before I did. And that's not the way this is supposed to work, but it did. And, I don't want to, I can't minimize what happened with my son, but I can accept it, and I can accept the grace that I found in the process. I don't appreciate Jesus if I don't need Him on a daily basis. And I can assure you that I have needed Him greatly in the last, 10 years or so. Lots happened in the last 10 years for me.
Right.
And, but the worst thing that I can think of beyond losing a child would be if there was no good that ever came out of it. If there was no redeeming quality to that, if it never served to benefit me or anybody else, that's true tragedy. And I think that's what's on the other side of that fence. If I cross back over there, that's what's waiting on the other side. So I do believe in the goodness of God. I do believe that it is because of His goodness that He allows us free choice. And sometimes that free choice hurts. And sometimes the free choice hurts by my hand, and sometimes it hurts by someone else's. But there's just who else has the words of eternal life? Going back to the words of Peter, there's just no better, there's no better second option that I can think of. And He has been the one that has gotten me through this. He was the one that I was crying out to. He was the one, I mentioned that getting on my knees in the morning and, asking God to keep me clean and sober. I still resort to that to this day. I don't do it every morning like I did in early sobriety, but man, when the stuff hits the fan, you'll find me on my knees, because that's just my go-to position. And God's just He's incredibly faithful to be able to bring good out of something that tragic. So,
well said. Anything you want to end on? Any last closing remarks?
I guess I would just, anytime I share my testimony, I always end with, the newcomer in mind. And so I would speak to anyone who is struggling. They're thinking that, maybe this is not the right way, or this is too high of a cost. This is too high of a price. I can't, I can't fit this into my schedule. That's one that I hear all the time. Oh, my work schedule. It's like, the recovery doesn't work like that. Recovery is not for the people who need it. There's a lot of people that need it. It's for the people who want it. Mm-hmm. It's the people who are willing to make a sacrifice, or willing to put their recovery before their job or even their family. It's kind of that putting your mask on yourself before you put it on your loved one. That's an absolute requirement for recovery. Mm. And when I got here, I thought that there was a dozen other problems that were bigger than my using. And I thought that if I solved all of these other problems and all these relational problems and all of these money problems and all of these, that was really what was making my life miserable. But those things were just symptoms of the actual problem. And so I chose to have faith enough, because I didn't see it in my life, but I saw it in people like you in your life. I saw it in the guys who were here when I got here, and I saw what was possible. And there's real, true, genuine freedom here. Mm. It's also possible to stay clean and sober for 10 or 20 years and to be a crotchety old son of a you-know-what and not have, any joy in your life whatsoever, And for me, it's the difference between behavior modification and transformation. Mm. And transformation, as far as I can tell, only happens through God and through Jesus. So that's my encouragement to anybody who's wondering if this is what's needed. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but you're not going to know until you try it. Mm. And so give it all you've got. And, as we kind of tongue-in-cheek say around here, if it's after 90 days, if you're not thoroughly satisfied, your misery will gladly be refunded.
That's right. That's right. That's another good one. Well, man, I can't think of a better way to end it. So thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it. And
thank you for the invite. This has been fun. I've enjoyed this.
Like I said, I was very excited to do this. And man, to hear what God's done in your life did not disappoint. So thank you guys. Check out some of the other episodes as well. And I appreciate you guys listening. Appreciate Darrell for being here. And I'll catch you guys in the next episode.